This meeting is being recorded.
Hey everyone, please feel free to use the chat box and introduce yourself, your name, your pronouns, and then where you're hailing from.
Thank you, Lyric. We're probably going to do the same thing we did last week, which is get started a few minutes after the hour so that folks have time to get in. I know I have the hardest time logging onto things on time that are remote. Like I am late for every minute or every meeting by like 2 or 3 minutes because I cannot keep track of time remotely. So we'll give people the same grace that I need, which is to realize I'm late for a meeting. And technically, all y'all are 1 minute early, and some of y'all had been waiting in the waiting room, so you were on top of it more than me. And you can absolutely drop your name, where you're from, and your pronouns. It is helpful for me to know what you do too, so I can keep it in mind as far as what you do at your agency or in the community. That helps me know who's in the room, particularly for this part of the presentation if you were here last week. Again, as we wait for folks to get in, if you want to put in your name, what you do at your agency, any info that may be helpful for folks to know, or for me to just have an idea of what you're doing and where you are. Hey, Bob, I know that this is random because I know we're on a call. Did you message Queer Swim? And if you did, will you let me know? Okay, cool. If y'all want to know an Austin resource, I host the Trans, Intersex, NB, and Queer Swim the second and fourth Sunday or Thursday of every month. And Bob had messaged to collaborate, and we get so many spam accounts that I was like, I don't even know how to verify this is the real person. Hello.
Hi, it's so nice to see you. Yes, it was me. Yes, yes, yes.
I love that. That's so fun. The community is just always so exciting to me, and I'm glad to see so many people. I know that we talked about it last week too, but having this be more accessible online and how many ways we've created more resources and more accessibility through the pandemic, I hope continues, because I did this presentation back for Echo, I think in 2019. And we had just a small group of people because it's you needing to take off the afternoon of work or transportation to get to the training because it was offsite, like all of the different reasons. So I'm glad to see folks from all over agencies across Austin being here. It's really exciting. We're going to give it maybe 2 more minutes to have everyone get in here and then we'll get going. And as you've seen, if you are joining a little bit later, if you want to put in your name, your pronouns, if you want, your agency, what you do at your agency, I'm reading them because it helps me know who's in the room and what you may be doing at your agency. I would also love if folks, as they settle in, I don't know how comfortable everyone is with Zoom, but there's a React where you can raise your hand and let me know if you attended last week so I can kind of have a feel for how many new people we have in the room. And it's totally okay if you didn't attend, it just will give me a better gauge. I recognize a lot of names, so that's good. Yeah, or you can do what Lori just did, which is just let me know in the chat. I was making it more complicated. I just love the little, reacts. But if you weren't here, I'll do that real quick. My name's Samantha Foss. I use they, them pronouns. I'm here in Austin, Texas. I'm the Director of Development and Communications for Texas Homeless Network, which is a statewide agency, but I have worked in homelessness for the past 3.5 years and spent close to a decade in domestic violence. So I worked in emergency shelter. I worked for the National Dating Abuse Helpline. I've worked in supportive housing. I've worked as a case manager. So I've kind of done the full gamut. I worked for Texas Council on Family Violence doing TA for domestic violence providers. And I also went up to North Carolina for a hot minute to work on LGBTQ specific training for domestic violence shelters around the state to help them create inclusive and best practice services for domestic violence survivors. So I have worked in shelters and with shelters and agencies both in Texas and North Carolina around LGBTQ clients in trying to ensure that we have culturally responsive and appropriate services for folks. And so that just gives you a little background if you happened to not be here last week of who I am. Also, I am house sitting for my sister. And so I am going to end up turning off my camera because it has been very hard for me today it's been glitching on my end. I haven't been freezing to people, but people have been freezing to me. But I wanted to show y'all this cute shirt that I have because I'm obsessed with it. And then also just so you know who's talking to you, because that's another hard part about virtual world. Because I'm going to turn off mine, I also want to just say I honor and respect if you want to turn off yours as well. It's always nice. Thank you, Bob. To see faces, but I know Zoom fatigue is real. If you don't want to have your camera on, that's totally okay. And I just want to offer that permission because, yeah, I love to see your faces. I just don't have to if you don't want to. Thank you, Derek. Okay, so we'll go ahead and dive in. I'm going to turn off my camera. And we'll get started. So last week, if you weren't here, we went over sexual orientations and gender identities. It was recorded. So if some of the words you're not familiar with or you're not comfortable with, even if you're an active ally or a part of the LGBTQ plus community, I like to think there's things that you could have learned last week. So if you didn't attend, highly recommend you checking out that recording when it gets sent out or asking Lyric for it. Today, we're going to be talking about equal access of the best practices for our LGBTQI plus neighbors. The reason we're talking about it, first and foremost, is HUD's equal access and gender identity rulings. In 2012, HUD issued the first of 3 rulings that focused on ensuring fair and equal access to housing for all Americans, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or any other reason around how they present or marital status. That first ruling was equal access to housing and HUD programs regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, and it essentially said that housing subject to HUD or fair housing rules should be made available without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. Building on that ruling, in 2016, HUD issued the final rule, which is equal access in accordance with an individual's gender identity in community planning and development programs rule. So that one made it to make sure that, and to ensure that all individuals have equal access to many of the department's core shelter programs in accordance with their gender identity. Following that, what had previously been encouraged was there, but it wasn't necessarily in stone, and providers that operate single-sex project in this ruling are required to provide all individuals, including trans individuals and other individuals that don't identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, with access to not only programs, but benefits, services, and any type of accommodations in accordance with their gender identity. And it outlines that that has to happen without intrusive questioning or being asked to provide documentation. We'll go over that later. That newest ruling again makes it so that programs need to grant equal access to facilities and services. They can't require any proof of individuals' gender identity, and providers must update policies and procedures to reflect requirements of that ruling and post it publicly. So when we're talking about how to stay in alignment with the HUD mandate, that's another, and we'll go into it, one of the ways to audit your programs. And the other thing that I would like to note at this point is, while this mandate is crucial and it is very important that it stays intact, we're not going to focus heavily on the mandate as the structure or the reason we're doing this. We're going to be exploring these practices that go beyond the ruling, that really aim to provide best care and best practices to clients that are LGBTQ plus. Because we really want to think, if this ruling was stripped, how could we ensure that we continuously offer access and do it because it is the right thing to do, not that we're mandated to do it. The other part of HUD's mission is to give every person and family access to safe, secure, and affordable housing, including fair and equal access to housing. And in doing so, under the Fair Housing Act and HUD rules, it's prohibited for any landlord or housing provider to discriminate against LGBTQ persons because of their real or perceived gender identity, meaning that whether or not someone is trans or non-binary, if they're perceived to be such and therefore discriminated against, it is prohibited. And it goes over some of the other things that I don't necessarily want, because y'all can find these things online. I don't think that this is where we need to spend our time. But it's important to know that all of these things are written in stone around access to any of HUD's programs or services. Okay. And with housing first in mind, what we really need to think about is how our shelters and programs run. So we need to make sure that we are creating low barrier and immediate access options for our neighbors who want and need them. By ensuring we have programs ready and able to serve all populations, we're creating the best program possible. So we need to make sure that when someone seeks our services, we meet them where they're at, both physical, emotional, any of the supports needed to take into account their identities. Our goal isn't to create, and we'll talk about this again and again, a one-size-fits-all project, but to make programs that are flexible, adaptable, and responsive to client and household needs, and acknowledge, recognize, and uplift all identities. So it's not giving shelter in spite of someone's gender identity or sexual orientation, but giving shelter with that identity seen, respected, and considered when providing services. And that should be kind of our core tenet as we move forward with this conversation is we're not doing it, and the same thing goes for when you're talking about loving someone. It's not in spite of their identity. It's part of the reasons that we see, respect, and celebrate their identity. And we talked about this a little bit last week, but if you weren't here, you may be asking yourself, why HUD mandated equal access and why do we need to talk about it today? And there's many reasons that it's crucial that we uphold equal access and why it's relevant. Not only, as we previously mentioned, it fills a huge need, but there's a lot of stats to back it up, such as 1 in 5 trans people in the United States have been discriminated against when seeking a home, and more than 1 in 10 have been evicted from their homes because of their gender identity. The average age of someone experiencing homelessness for the first time among LGBTQ plus youth is 15 years old. Nearly 2/3 of homeless shelters failed to enroll a trans person appropriately, if at all, once they disclosed their identity. And nearly 1/4 of trans shelter clients experiencing homelessness report being assaulted by other residents or staff. And to really, to begin this exploration together, it's helpful to recognize some of the common discrimination practices. Many of these practices aren't meant to harm, but have unintended consequences that can traumatize, re-traumatize, or restrict access for clients that are LGBTQ+. Some of the practices are like the practice of screening out callers that identify as LGBTQ. It's pretty common, and the reasons can vary. It can be about bringing a concern of bringing in a client that has too many perceived conservative or anti-LGBTQ clients. So in the case manager or the intake person's mind, they're saying they're protecting this LGBTQ client by not bringing them into a potential hostile environment. Or believing that the agency doesn't have the best services for the client and therefore not giving them the opportunity to seek services. So again, like the common practice of thinking we're doing what's best for the client without giving them the option. Another reason that, or another discrimination practice is requiring proof of gender identity before enrolling a client. And as we discussed on the last slide, that's actually strictly prohibited, but is a common practice. And we talked about it last week, but no matter how that client expresses their identity in dress, hairstyle, or gender presentation, we have to provide services based on the gender identity as presented to you for all of the reasons we talked about last week, right? Because regardless, there is never a time in which someone's gender presentation should be your sole factor in deciding that their identity is valid, because there are a lot of classist things around that, right? So access to an inclusive barber, or hair cutting place, hairstylist, or access to new clothing when you're already housing unstable, or access to hormone treatment, or all of the different reasons why someone's gender presentation might not match their gender identity. The next practice is a site manager who enforces project rules differently for a single father household as opposed to a single mother household. And while this practice is not exclusively LGBTQ focused, it's also not permitted. The same rules must apply no matter the gender of the parent and regardless of if they were assigned that gender at birth or not. In the two of the most common practices are management of housing projects failing to address or inappropriately addressing complaints from LGBTQ clients and predetermining procedures for LGBTQ clients prior to entering a specific client into services. The other, and we'll go into that later. And then the other one is when a client complains about harassment from another client, agencies remove or move the LGBTQ person. And in their mind, it's an effort to keep their safety, but really the best practice is to ask that client what would be best for them. And we'll go over that later, but those are two really common things. And what the reason we're talking about these is because a lot of these are out of best intentions, but not out of best practice, if that makes sense to y'all. We're preemptively trying to protect the safety of trans clients or LGBTQ clients overall. But what it's really doing is it's disempowering people even more. So an example, I run an emergency shelter for women. My shelter only has congregate sleeping and bathroom facilities with no privacy for any clients. One of the women staying in the shelter comes to staff and identifies as transgender. Do I allow her to continue using the same facilities as other clients? I would love to hear if y'all feel you can unmute or you can type in an answer. But I would love to hear your reaction to that question. Jerry says yes. Lori says yes. I know it can always be intimidating to guess publicly, especially when we're not all in the room together. We'll go through a few of these, so definitely only answer the ones you want to answer, or just make a mental note. It's hard, and this is the only time that it's hard when we're not in groups, because we're also going to do a few that I normally do breakout groups for. So I want to respect that it's harder to guess in front of colleagues that can't see. Okay. Thank y'all for everyone that answered. So the answer is yes. You would still provide her services. The only exception to this is if the client comes to you and says he's a trans male, you may move him to a men's shelter. Or if the client comes to you and identifies as non-binary, you may ask which of your gendered shelters aligns best with their gender identity and safety. So really, it's yes for a trans woman being in a women's shelter. The only thing that would matter is if he is a trans male, that you would move him to a men's shelter if you have single sex shelters. So I know we just went over a bunch of discriminatory practices, and we're going to switch to common best practices. And so one of the things I like to take a moment, and again, this is different when we're virtual, but if anyone would like to share any common best practices that your agency is doing that you're proud of, that you like that y'all are implementing. Some of the practices that other people have listed are things like including visibly LGBTQ people on brochures, on the website, adding pronouns to agency signature lines, revamping non-discrimination policies, paying LGBTQ training for staff and volunteers, etc. So if there's anything that you are proud of. And Linda, you can drop your questions. I may or may not answer them depending on, because I have time at the end as well, but I would love to know. And if anyone has anything they want to unmute or put in the chat of things that they're proud of. I love rainbow connections. Ungendered bathrooms. That's super cool. And we'll go over a lot of them right now. So if you're going, oh gosh, I don't know what we're doing, you will probably be surprised with the amount of things, hopefully, well, that your agency is doing, and maybe just a few things that we can improve upon. But in 2022, I feel like we're all at least trying to figure out what to do if we're here right now. And that is wonderful that your agency is letting you take time to be here today. While there are many things an agency can do to support and respect LGBTQ clients, these are some of the common best practices, like using transgender inclusive language in documents and verbally, ensuring a safe and welcoming program environment, practicing confidentiality and discretion, and creating inclusive and appropriate policy standards for staff and residents. And we're going to break down those pieces, because really what I want y'all to walk away with today is some ideas of things to do, and just some hopefully affirmations that y'all are already doing things well. So inclusive language, it should involve written and verbal communications. If you didn't attend last week's session, I would say it's again pretty crucial for you to watch the recording, and also say, even if you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community or an active ally, to watch it and just be aware of new information. I know I talked about it last week, but there's so many things I learn every day. And I have been out as non-binary for almost 10 years and queer since I was a wee lad. So, and I am still constantly learning things. So it's never a bad idea to stay open to learning more. The goal is to honestly become aware and practice compassion as we get to know people. And this is especially true for the LGBTQ community, where every day the empowerment and expansion of this community, our community, flourishes. New words, new terms are being created every day by older and younger generations. Old terms are being recognized for their flaws and being removed from vernacular. So that's always a good thing to be aware of, the ones that we're like, oh, we're going to pass on that now. And it's just good to be culturally aware of the LGBTQ community. And it takes ongoing commitment and work, and that is any marginalized community. And so as we move forward, we'll talk about some of that language, but really that's why I'm saying it's helpful for last week, is because you're going to get some of that inclusive language from that training. Some of the best practices for inclusive language is things like expanded gender and sexual orientations and identities on intake forms, which we'll have an example of in a minute, updating policies and procedures for intake and screening processes, and educating staff and volunteers on LGBTQ affirming language. Those are all necessary steps to ensure trans inclusive care from the get-go. So when we're thinking about first impressions, we need to think about our hotline intake coordinators, we need to think about our admin staff, we need to think about our brochures, our website, like all of the ways that we're making sure LGBTQ affirming language is in every step of the process. Additionally, offering your pronouns and mirroring other pronouns are important. So rather than asking someone to tell you their pronouns, a good start is introducing yourself in person or on the phone with your pronouns, the same thing we talked about last week. So for example, a call on the hotline may sound like, hi, Thank you for calling Hope Shelter. My name is Samantha. I use they, them pronouns. Are you in a safe place to talk right now? Many times that this is a cue to LGBTQ clients that you're either an ally or a part of the community. It essentially is just a good signal that you recognize and are ready to affirm pronouns. They may or may not offer pronouns back, and it's important to not assume pronouns unless absolutely necessary. And most of the time, if so, you're just going to use they, them. And then once you know their pronouns, the other really specific and critical point is once you know them, use them. So many times, especially using they, them in life, how many times people have asked me my pronouns and then continued to misgender me is astonishing. So if you're gonna ask people's pronouns, please actually use them. If you mess up, say sorry, correct yourself, and move on. It's not helpful to expand on the reasons you messed up or how you have done this training or that your shelter is a safe place. All of those are just ego strokes to yourself. All you need to do is say sorry and then not do it again. I will note too here that it's important not to assume family relationships, particularly on intake. And that includes gendering partners or assuming someone is in a relationship with someone of a certain gender or a different gender. It's another clear sign during an intake process to an LGBTQ client if you're a safe person or a safe shelter. So you can ask in gender neutral ways if they're cohabitating with someone or traveling with someone or with someone by saying, are you currently in a relationship? Are you living with anyone? Do you have family that will also need services? Just really thinking about how to expand the way we ask really common questions that are helpful for context of the services they may need or the supports they may have available, but really keeping that more inclusive language when we're talking to them. The caveat to asking further with clients is thinking, do I need to actually ask this in order to provide them with services before asking the question? If the answer is yes, ask and provide context to why you're asking. An example of that is when asking, at our shelter, we have 2 facilities, one for women and non-binary folks, and one for men and non-binary folks. What is your gender identity so we can look to see if there's space for you to stay with us? So what may feel like a very invasive question gives them context for the reason you're asking. You're saying, we have 2 facilities. I want to make sure we have you in the facility that aligns with your gender identity. Another trans inclusive language practice is removing honorifics, which is very hard for Southern folks. I was very much raised on saying ma'am or miss or Mr. or sir as a sign of respect. And while this is very well intentioned, it can cause extreme dysphoria or at the very least discomfort for folks who identify as trans or non-binary when you use the wrong honorifics. So if you call a trans woman sir because she does not appear to look like a female to you, or because her voice is deep when you're doing an intake on the phone, you can cause dysphoria, which can really cause a great amount of distress in a person. That those responses can be anxiety, nausea, depression, anger, all of the trauma responses that you can guess. So it is best in our personal and professional lives, even when you're checking out at Taco Cabana or Walgreens, is to remove miss or Mr. or ma'am or sir from your vocabulary. Instead of using language to show respect, I encourage you to show it through actions. Actions such as being polite, respectful, responsive, and inclusive go a lot further than any word can. So another really just personal and professional thing is if you're Southern like me, to start to count how many times you say it in your daily life, and it'll really help you realize the massive amount of assumptions you make on a daily basis about someone's gender. Because if you could, I know that I have my camera off, but you would almost guaranteed she, her, me at Target, and I have used they, them for 10 years. And so I can't say enough how much it hurts everywhere I go. And I know that it's not just a Sam's central conversation, but it's important to just say you can't assume someone's gender based on their presentation. This is an example on the last slide of expanding sexual orientation and gender identity on intake forms. That helps us just provide best services to people. I know that for many times for funding and for data, it's hard to have the best practice if you did not have any barriers to funding would just to be having a slot that people fill in themselves. But because many of us rely on funding and need to have these data points, we at least do the identity not listed, please specify, instead of othering it. You may be surprised with how many people self-identify in your community once you've given them the option to do so. Displayed here is one of the many options available for intake forms. You can search online to find a form that best fits your needs if you feel like y'all's need revamping. But really the main goal is to remove the other, right? Because it removes the taboo of other. And still gives someone an opportunity to self-identify in a way that feels good if it's not listed. The other important thing to note on an intake form is you're really going to try to remove preferred pronouns. So I see a lot on intake forms of it saying, what is your preferred pronoun? We talked about it last week again, but it's important to just say, what pronoun do you use, or pronouns, and just leave it at that, because pronouns are not preferred. They're just simply our identities. If I were to misuse the wrong pronoun with you, it would not be, you prefer for me to use the correct ones. You would want me to use your pronouns. Additionally, not listed in this example is asking what pronoun they use publicly. So that's another good thing to think about when doing an intake, is a client may feel comfortable asking for another gender pronoun with you as a case manager, but may not want to use it in publicly or within the agency overall. So it's important to clarify the level of disclosure, which we'll talk about in a moment. One of my other favorite things about this particular intake form is having straight be not the first thing listed. Up here, man and woman is, but just playing with the order of things so that it is not a hierarchy, which we often see. Many times, in an attempt to ensure the comfort of our clients, we proactively assume their wants, which can lead to unintended harm, like I talked about before. So it's important that your program do the work to understand the needs or an array of clients' needs overall, but be ready to be responsive to direct person asks. So we can absolutely make plans for scenarios, but a client needs to be involved with choosing the scenario that works best for their needs. That can mean not segregating unless requested. And for example, you may think about in a congregant all women shelter, it would be best to use your single occupancy room for a trans woman client. And while the client may choose this option, you need to ask her what she wants. Would she like to sleep in the congregate area or have her own room? And we'll go into that further, but that's kind of that first bullet point of don't make a plan before asking the client. We also don't want to out a client unless they say it's okay. And that means following the lead on a client's wants through intake procedure. If the client would like you to tell all of the staff so that you're the intake person and they just want you to relay the information so they don't have to tell everyone, you totally can, and you can steward those conversations. or tell other staff, but only with the discretion and permission of your client, i.e., they say, yes, you can tell the shelter director, but I don't need every other case manager to know, et cetera, of having direct and informed and specific consent, the same way you would about any other identity that may be discriminated against. In all scenarios or considerations in our project, we must prioritize safety and well-being of those often discriminated against. First, we do so by creating a specific non-discrimination form that we go over in detail with these clients. Many times our programs will have specific LGBTQ non-discrimination forms that each client signs upon intake. These forms will let the client know that non-discrimination is required to stay enrolled in services and that your program will and does serve transgender, non-binary, and other people who are in the LGBTQ plus community. By making this part clear and thorough, you ensure that every person knows the standards and ethos of your agency. So the reason we talk about that is every person, regardless of their identity, needs to know that non-discrimination or discrimination isn't an option, right? A lot of times we'll only talk about it with the people that we think might get discriminated against. When an issue does occur, your staff will know to prioritize the safety and well-being of those discriminated against. I'll take a second to talk a little bit further about this. Because many times this is a big sticking point for people who may or may not still hold anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ feelings. They'll want, whether consciously or not, to protect the straight or cisgender clients from the discomfort of being around a trans person without thinking about the level of discrimination that trans person faces on a daily basis. Many programs will say, I can't have a masculine presenting non-binary person enter my women's shelter. What if that's triggering to women to see someone who has male characteristics? Oftentimes that's flawed logic, as they have male staff, male contractors, male children, etc. And beyond that, there are males all around the world and masculine presenting people all around the world. The fact is, shelter is often triggering and upsetting for many, if not most clients. Shelter isn't a fun place to be. When we're asking a client who is likely going through something they feel is traumatic, oftentimes homelessness and domestic violence, we're asking them to live in a building with a world of experiences. They're surrounded by people who may cuss, may be loud, may be overtly and aggressively religious, may be messy, may be angry, may be deeply sad, may be using, maybe doing lots of things that can be triggering to past experiences. There is no way to deny how hard it is, but how very common it is. The important thing to do is to say, how do I best serve the client who is being discriminated against? The same is true for a Jewish client who has practices during a holy day in a majority Christian makeup in a shelter, or a Muslim woman who wears her hijab in a saras. All cases in which someone is being discriminated against, we must uphold the safety and well-being of that person. And all that's to say is it's hard to do in shelter, but it does not mean we shouldn't try. If we're more worried about keeping peace than providing best care for our most marginalized clients, we need to look and examine our own biases. And no matter what we're doing or what steps we need to do to make it so that the client feels informed and is offering active and explicit consent, we're not their saviors, we're only their stewards. We are not their saviors, we are only their stewards. We are here to provide them with a service to their expectations and needs. In order to offer that stewardship, we need to empower and accept their self-determination. Self-determination is fundamental to all clients in HUD's projects. So while shelter and project staff may offer accommodations based on safety concerns and other valid professional considerations, HUD's ruling makes it clear that at no time are shelter staff permitted to require a trans or non-binary client to accept an accommodation because of their gender identity. And however, the accommodation should be available to clients based on a variety of factors that can increase one's vulnerability and not just be restricted to use by trans or non-binary clients. One of the important reasons to do that and to offer it is because you don't want that accommodation to essentially out someone. You don't want to have the trans or non-binary room that is a private room that essentially outs anyone that stays in it, because that's what it's flagged as. And last, however, the comparable option may be if the best idea is to have them be off-site, that shelter would give obviously the same services and the same type of service project outside of the site that they would inside. So that means all of the services that a client would get within your shelter should be able to be accessed if they are outside of your shelter, because sometimes that really is the last resort best option in some facilities and for some people. Bathroom accommodations are another one that we have to think about throughout many programs, is thinking about single-use bathroom options and what ways it could look to make sure that people have access to a safe bathroom at all times. Really, one of the best ways, because I know that this can be a big sticking point for programs, the best option is having a staff member bathroom be the available option for this purpose when you don't have any other options. So the ones like having stalls with locking doors or having a shower schedule or any of these things, if the best that your shelter can offer is to having at least the staff bathroom be a private, safe option for a trans or non-binary client or an LGBTQ client overall. So beyond intake forms, it's also a good idea to think about the ways that you can ensure a safe and welcoming environment. Specifically, when thinking about the LGBTQ community, what ways are you signaling to the community and potential clients that your shelter is LGBTQ inclusive and affirming? It's one thing to accept a client into your shelter or program. It's another thing to celebrate their identity. We can't just begrudgingly follow equal access mandate. We need to work on affirming and celebrating the LGBTQ community. Some things to think about of ways to create that open environment is, are you including diversity in your marketing materials by highlighting trans and queer people on your website and brochures? Are you describing clients to the media and including non-binary language and trans inclusive language? How are you talking about clients' family structures? How are you framing survivors or those experiencing homelessness in the context of talking to media? Who are you portraying as the victim versus the survivor? Who are you showing as your clients? And what about your team makeup? Do you have staff or volunteers that are LGBTQ? If you do, are they folks who hold other identities, such as someone who's Indigenous, a person of color, or someone with a disability? Are these intersections reflected in your agency's leadership? What about in your board or on your committees? Because really, by having voices in your agency that are LGBTQ, your agency really is internally upheld to being accountable and remaining vigilant to best practices if you're creating a safe environment in which your LGBTQ staff can give feedback. And then in your actual shelter, we're talking about artwork and decorations. How are we creating safe restrooms and sleeping areas? Another main point to drive home is HUD's visibility mandate. So do you have clear and posted policies that explicitly state the equal access policies in your agency? If your agency is decorated, are LGBTQ identities reflected in artwork or posters? And really a way to do it, and I know that this is hard for some folks depending on your community and how you're involved, but if you were to imagine walking in as a trans person or a non-binary person, can you audit it and can you say that you would actually feel safe? And if not, what would it look like? If you don't have that experience or no one on your staff really does, could you have community members or clients thoughtfully critique your program? The last best practice is confidentiality and discretion. As I said earlier, how you serve an LGBTQ client should be focused on their wants. When talking about special accommodations as options for a client, it's important to discuss whether or not those accommodations may out them. So, does everyone sleep communally? If so, putting a client in a single room may highlight that they have special needs or may out them as trans or non-binary. Being really clear with a lot of these ways that you could potentially out someone. Do you have a therapy group for LGBTQ clients? If so, does the client understand the confidentiality challenges with group therapy and the risks that come along with being in one if they're not out to everyone in the community? As long as the client realizes the potential outcome of what they choose, you should and can respect what they want. Do they need a single bathroom? If so, do they use the staff bathroom? Is there one that has a lock? What about communal lounge areas? And kind of honestly, what support do they need around relaxation, right? In a highly marginalized community that may have stacked depressions and therefore stacked stressors of if there is a place for them to have reprieve if harassment does occur. And another piece is if a client says that they're openly out, it's your duty not to assume you have the right to out them anyway. So when processing an intake, you should ask whether or not they want other staff to know. What about other clients? What about health professionals as they sign releases for you to talk to them? It really should be explicit and time-specific releases of information, regardless of their sexual or gender identity, but particularly if so. And just as a side note, we ran short on time last week, so I know that I rushed through it, but it's never okay to out family or friends no matter how close you are to them. You don't pull out your queer family member or your trans family member as a token of the reason why you're an ally. You also just don't do it in general, no matter your intent, because we know from watching all of the media and experiencing the American experience right now, it's not always safe for people to know, and it's not your right to share private information. Okay, we're gonna do another example. A client named Gina comes to complain to you about another client who is a lesbian hitting on her. What is the next right step? Not the conclusion of the conflict, not assuming who is in the right, but just what is the next immediate right step. You can either unmute, you can put into chat, or we're just gonna give like a few seconds to think about it. So we have ask if she feels unsafe, ask how they were specifically hit on, speak to the other client to hear both sides of the situation. Jerry said to redirect them to express their feelings to that person. So really the first step is letting Gina know that you've heard her complaint. A lot of the times when things like this happen, folks just want to be heard, and it may be a projection of something bigger that's happening, or really hearing where Gina's at, but also reminding her that you can't confirm or deny the other client's sexual orientation, but that you'll discuss it with your supervisor. It's important to, in this moment, to not out the client nor validate Gina's complaint until you gather more information. So you're not going to over affirm Gina's experience. You're going to maybe mirror the language and say, I heard that you said this. I'm going to take this to my supervisor. So you're really taking, I know that someone said active listening, you're really just hearing her and then saying you're going to gather it and make sure that you can validate that she's having those feelings, but not necessarily whether she's right or wrong. Depending on what your supervisor says, you may speak to the other client, gather more information on the situation, and really thinking about where the power dynamics are when handling conflicts like this. But the main thing to really think about is a lot of times in those moments, and the reason we use this as an example is it's very easy for us to default to wanting Gina to feel better before we really think about the full situation. Because again, when I was talking about earlier, that kind of default for a lot of people is to want to comfort the cis or straight person. We're going to do another example. You work at a large shelter that requires that a person use their ID every time they enter shelter. You see a client named Jeff has not had the resources to change his ID to reflect that he is male, and he tells you that as he hands his ID. You know he is male and uses he, him pronouns from your intake the other day. What do you do next? And again, you don't have to answer in chat, but I just want to give y'all a minute to think about it. Essentially, the question is that Jeff has to give his ID every time he enters shelter. You notice he hasn't had the resources to change his ID to reflect that he's male, and he tells you this as he hands you his ID. Doesn't say it has to be accurate. LOL, I love that. And I would say, Derek, that could be right. I know that I had said it and it doesn't show it on this, but you know from doing an intake earlier in the week, or it doesn't necessarily specify when, but you know he uses he, him pronouns. Really, the best thing to do in this moment is to assess the safety of discussing this with Jeff, right? If other clients are waiting behind him in line, you may verify his picture looks like him. You already know it because you did an intake with him earlier. Hand it back and check in with him later when less people are around to hear. Again, he offered you that. He said that he said it as he handed you his ID, but you want to assess the safety, and if there are bunches of people around, you don't want to necessarily get into the details of the resources to change his ID. You don't want to bring more attention to it in that moment than necessary. But if he's telling you this when no one else is around, you may let him know that you have staff that can help him get resources in order to change his ID. Hopefully, as a staff, you've thought about in Austin or in Texas overall, what resources are available to help people change their ID. And really, depending on what state you were born, it can be hard to do for your Social Security as well, or your birth certificate. And so thinking about the ways you can help him navigate those. And I know a lot of people put it in the chat, which I love. You should not require his ID to match his gender expression or gender identity. It doesn't matter what his ID says, but you know that he cared about it because he brought it up. And he may not care about it. He may have just been worried that you cared about it. So whatever the case may be, you can tell him there's resources, but what you really want to do is not have his ID have to match his gender expression or gender identity, not out him to other shelter residents by discussing it if there's a bunch of people around, or declining him services based on this information. Now, if you liked a lot of these training scenarios, I sent it to Lyric prior, and she'll send it out once we do the follow-up emails. But HUD has a lot of these training scenarios. I would highly advise y'all to go through them in an all-staff meeting or use them as a basis for an agency training. My caveat would be to make sure you have someone in the room that can really facilitate the conversations around it. Ideally, someone that is LGBTQ that you're paying to help facilitate that. That shouldn't just be you relying on the most aware folks in your agency to do that labor for you. In these training scenarios, HUD talks about what the best right step to do is. So I'm not saying that HUD's answers are wrong. It's just if people are giving answers that may be a bit problematic, that you have someone there that can help facilitate those conversations and talk about maybe the discomfort that sits with the right answers. This is also one of my favorite things to facilitate in person of these training scenarios. So I can't speak highly enough of having like small breakout groups or small staff opportunities to work through things like this, and not just with LGBTQ, but overall, because what we really want to do is preemptively have a lot of these conversations. Again, we're not trying to create a concrete path of this is what we do when a non-binary person comes into shelter. We're not trying to make scenarios as our absolutes of what we would do. We're trying to be creative, responsive, and flex those muscles of thinking through things, a lot of different marginalized identities, so you can take this as a tool moving forward and have more for things beyond trans or LGBTQ identities. So now that we've discussed a lot of different considerations, we want to kind of talk about those next steps. If you're frontline staff, i.e. like shelter intake counseling or other direct service staff, there are things you can consider and talk about with your agency. I'm going to take a drink of water because I really need to cough. Hold on. First, you can reflect on what else you need to have in place to feel comfortable serving LGBTQ clients as yourself. This is sometimes the hardest thing to do personally, is to really do our own self-inventory about what ways we hold biases or gaps of knowledge, because our egos are very tender. We're human, and so it's hard for us to sometimes acknowledge our knowledge gaps, and the fact that y'all are here hopefully has you at least open and aware of some new things to learn. But really thinking about what you need to do to feel comfortable serving LGBTQ clients, so you don't feel like you're going to stumble if a trans woman walks into your shelter, or a non-binary person that uses he, him walks into your shelter, that you should feel comfortable with all of the different types of identities that people hold. One of the things around that is, do you secretly or openly not support LGBTQ clients? If so, how do you staff with your boss or agency around if someone comes in who identifies as LGBTQ? Because it's also okay, it's not okay, it's not ideal, but to own it, right? So if you're a case manager, you don't openly support LGBTQ clients, can you acknowledge that and have someone else be the case manager for that client as you work through your feelings, right? Because whether or not you're wanting to push past them, the ways that we show up for people, the same way you want a therapist that really affirms LGBTQ identities, right? Or you want a healthcare practitioner that really affirms LGBTQ identities. If you're still in that struggle place, acknowledge it, staff it with your boss or agency to talk about, like, how can you be the best ally by not being the first point of contact because you're not there yet? And that is a very valid place to be. And hopefully you being here is part of you working on it. Other ways you can is volunteering at your local LGBTQ group, or another lower barrier way is to look up LGBTQ educational YouTube channels. There's so many good ones. If you were in the training last week, I use a lot of videos because there's a lot of good ones out there. And the more diverse voices you have, the more likely you are to feel comfortable. Reading through a queer author, fundraising for LGBTQ youth services, being involved, all of the different ways to build empathy for LGBTQ identities. Beyond, watch Queer Eye, beyond individual needs, review and study your agency's anti-discrimination policy, really looking to see if it's aligned with your continuum of care policies and HUD mandates, looking to see if it's posted publicly. And as you're talking as staff about how you feel about cultivating a shelter-in program that feels safe for LGBTQ folks. So maybe having some of the fun conversations that feel low priority but can be a big deal to a lot of people, which is decorations, kitchen areas, brochures, books in the communal library that you could help create a shelf of resources or things for people to read. Are there other things that you can help do to make sure that people have access to resource lists that are LGBTQ specific? Can we actually look for culturally aware, responsive, and appropriate physical health doctors, counselors, housing programs, employment opportunities, any other services? How are we vetting those on an ongoing basis and talking to the community about if they're good resources? Because the last thing we want to do as frontline staff is to re-traumatize anyone or traumatize them for the first time, because if we send them to a client that or a counselor that doesn't know non-binary identities, we're going to send them to a counselor that is for sure going to misgender them and just cause more trauma. If we're going to send them to a sexual health clinic as a trans female that knows nothing about sexual health care for trans women, what are we doing for that client? So we need to ensure that we're doing the work to make sure we're not sending people places that will traumatize or harm them. If we don't have many local resources, which in all honesty, sometimes Austin doesn't, depending on what you're looking at, we need to think about online resources such as web-based counseling, trans-inclusive Facebook groups, trans healthcare books, etc. And we need to be thinking about how to make sure we're being aware or at least acknowledging our community shortcomings. For managers or directors, I would still recommend all of the other steps because they're relevant to you. But you can think about ways in which you can support the LGBTQ community overall. So if your agency fundraises, for our partners in fundraising, can a small amount of the proceeds go to a systemically oppressed population, such as immigrant folks or people of color or LGBTQ folks? How are we making sure marginalized people are represented? If your agency does community volunteer days, could you volunteer for an LGBTQ organization? Really, one of the best ways too is to table at LGBTQ events and have the people that table the events actually be LGBTQ affirming. But being out in the community, it's important to be visible and not just expect people to come find you. Can you work with LGBTQ community members to make a diversity committee at your agency and pay them to do that? Can you be creative on how to get community involved? Because no matter the amount of rainbow stickers you have or LGBTQ affirming brochures, none of that will make up for the fact that you're not engaging with and uplifting the community on an ongoing basis. If you're not involved in the community, having a rainbow flag outside of your office or your agency won't mean anything, particularly because for LGBTQ folks, the most likely way they are to find services or enter services is word of mouth. So being out in the community, providing good services is going to be the way that you create an LGBTQ safe place, not your flag. This is an example of an anti-discrimination policy. It states that an applicant or participant who believes they have been discriminated against on the basis of disability has the right to file a complaint under ADA in Section 504. Program management shall review and investigate, if necessary, all complaints. Any person whose requests for accommodation are not fully granted by the agency or staff shall be informed of their right to file complaint or grievance. Individuals who believe they have been discriminated against on the basis of disability, including failure to provide reasonable accommodation, may also file a complaint with HUD. And this is the example for the procedures for participants to file a complaint that should be posted publicly. That is also required. And y'all, again, will have access to this. We can look at an anti-discrimination requirements for a COC program recipients and ESG program recipients. And while these are, and I forgot to mention this, because while these aren't exclusive to equal access, they're intersectional with LGBTQ clients and must be followed when providing care to clients. So I know that when we're looking at some of these, we may go, well, why is this relevant to equal access? But Fair Housing Act prohibits discriminatory housing practices based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or familial status. There are so many different things that it covers that make sure that people are not discriminated against. In my experience, many people have gotten most excited about the outline of the anti-discrimination requirements that we just went over, which is also why I spend the least amount of time on it, because, well, I'm so thankful that people want to use that language to implement. It's not the explicit goal. Kind of really my hope is that you use the COC or HUD language as framework, but that you tailor the language for your community and think specifically about your program. Your definition, grievance policy, or anti-discrimination work may expand far beyond what we just went over. So I just want you to remain open to critically thinking before just copy and pasting. And this is one of the pieces of another thing that is going to be sent out to you, because I know it's a little bit hard to read. But it's another way for us to ensure equal access across the full spectrum of services. So we look at outreach and engagement, assessment, referral, enrollment, unit and bed assignment, or ongoing service provision as some of the different ways where we can audit what is encouraging or discouraging to people in the LGBTQ community. So for an example, a staff does not ask the clients assigned sorry, the staff doesn't ask the clients assigned at birth sex during the intake process. So the sex they were assigned at birth, encouraging when it doesn't matter, versus a staff that treats someone differently or asks invasive questions about what they were assigned at birth when all they really need to know is the person's gender identity, at least upon intake. Because again, we may want to know more so that we can figure out what healthcare provider, if someone needs to go to a sexual health doctor, etc. But upon intake and enrollment, that shouldn't matter yet. Discouraging is a staff moves the gender non-binary client when a conflict arises based on the client's gender identity, versus a staff person quickly resolves conflicts and allows it to be confidential. And these just kind of go over, Lucia, that's gonna be in the follow-up from Lyric. I think, if I remember right, these got pulled down during our last president's term, and I don't think they've ever been re-put anywhere on the internet, but I have PDFs of them. But this is a really good thing to also go over and think about, and maybe talk to staff members about some of the language, because it was during Obama's term, is not, again, exactly the way I would say things, because language is alive, forever changing. But for the most part, this is good language. So now I would love to open it up and kind of hear what y'all plan on doing next, or any thoughts you have about what you're going to take away from today. I know that we have a good amount of time and we'll go to Q&As next, but I would love the opportunity to hear about something that you're going to take away from this training today. Just so I know that anything landed at home with y'all, or you have any action steps that you took, and you can either unmute or put it into the chat. And I'm gonna put my email too, but if there's ever anything, like I know that Bob just put about intake forms, if y'all ever have any questions, you can always reach out as well. And Alex said they like the scenarios. They're very, once you go through the full PDF too, a lot of them are really interesting. And it's also, sometimes we have different answers in Austin versus if I was in Hondo, Texas, where it's a small shelter, right? So they also, best practices versus what's practical can also vary from place to place. They're fun to think about as a team. And that's really great about front loading on the assessments to become more inclusive. The assessments are very, it's hard because I feel like a lot of times it will be particularly hotline workers or intake folks over the phone do the most amount of micro or direct aggressions against folks because they're trying to rush through the quickest intake. And I think that it's really important for us to think about all of those assessments we do on the phone or in person with folks. I also just really love this gift, so I could stay on this page forever because that dog brings me pure joy. Like, what a happy little pup. Okay, we'll go to the Q&As. If anyone has anything they want to ask about, the one thing I'll say is if it's program very specific, I'm gonna politely decline if I don't think that it's relevant to the whole folks, because sometimes people want TA on a very specific case or something. But if you have general questions, I am happy and willing to answer them. And we can go past this one to just my email for folks to have. I love Schitt's Creek, so I also sprinkle that in. And if you were here last week, you saw that as well. Oh gosh, sorry. Does no one have any questions? It's okay. If not, we can all get a little bit less than 15 minutes of our day back, but I just want to be available if anyone has anything. And I know too, it can be hard when we're in a public setting to ask questions that we may feel embarrassed about asking or concerned about asking in front of other colleagues. So if that's ever the case too, I would encourage you to reach out or to talk to a team member that may have also been on this with you. I know that I get more questions in person than I do online because also there's a physical representation of what you asked, but yeah. We'll give it like 2 more minutes. And if anyone has any burning questions.
I'll just go ahead and unmute. This is Bob. Can you hear me?
I can.
Samantha? I just wanted to say thank you so much for this training. As a member of the LGBTQIA2+ community, I'm always amazed at and thrilled by how much I still have to learn. I never want to feel like I have everything figured out. That sounds like the end of a race and not the beginning of an adventure. And I just want to thank you so much. And I look forward to watching the previous one as well that I didn't know about. So yeah, less questions and just a lot of gratitude. Thank you. This was really, really, really informative and I appreciate your time.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Thank you so much. I wish you could see how big my smile is, but I'm afraid it'll mess up my internet, but it's huge, I promise you. And I feel the same exact way. Like, it is fascinating to me just, and really helps me get through the days to know how much there is more to learn. Like every day that's hard, I know that the reason to keep going is because there's so much more to learn and love about each other. So it's really special. Okay, well then I think we'll wrap up 10 minutes early. Hopefully that gives you all time to like go get a snack or whatever before the next thing you have to do. But really, truly, I mean that I'm available if y'all ever want to connect. We have our annual conference for THN in Austin this year. So if you happen to go, I would love to meet you. And yeah, I just really appreciate all y'all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. I really, really appreciate this training and I learned a lot. I say, hey guys a lot, and that's because I'm from Indiana and I need to learn that I can't do stuff like that anymore.
So hard.
Yeah, it really is. It's automatic and then I'm like, oh my God, I need to stop that. Yeah, thank you so much. And then for all the attendees, you will get the registration, or not registration, but if you've registered and you're here, you will get the recording as well as all the handouts that Sam talked about today. And then keep a lookout for any reminder emails for the Adverse Community Training that's happening next Tuesday from 3 to 4 p.m. So thank you guys so much. And oh my God, thank you all so much. And stay cool.
You too. Bye, y'all.